A title is only worth what its chain of ownership can prove. My retirement account read zero. My daughter had texted me a photo from a beach in Bali 3 hours earlier. Thank you for this, Dad. Trip of a lifetime. I didn't recognize the beach. I didn't recognize the man standing next to her in the photo either, not at first. If you're watching this, tell me where you're tuning in from and hit subscribe because you're going to want to see how far this one goes. Let me walk you through exactly how it started. My name is Walter Hensley. I'm 68 years old, and for 31 years I worked as a title examiner in Columbus, Ohio, tracing the ownership history of property back through decades of deeds, liens, and quit claims, looking for the one broken link that could sink an entire sale. People think it's boring work. It isn't. Every piece of land in this country has a story, and somewhere in that story, if you look hard enough, there's always a gap somebody tried to paper over. I got very good at finding the gap. It was a Thursday morning in April, the kind where the light comes in low and gold through the kitchen window and lands right on the counter where Eleanor used to sit with her coffee and her crossword. She's been gone 2 years now. Pancreatic cancer took her in 11 weeks, which the doctors called fast, though it did not feel fast to me. Since then, the kitchen has a silence in it that I've mostly made peace with. I still make 2 cups of coffee some mornings out of habit and pour the second one down the sink. I sat at that counter with my tablet doing what I do every Friday. No, it was a Thursday, but I'd moved my banking check up a day because Eleanor's old pension distribution was due, and I opened the banking app to check the balance on our joint retirement account. The number that came up wasn't the $485,000 I'd watched grow for 3 decades. It was $3.12. I want to tell you, I gasped, that my hand shook, that I dropped the tablet. None of that happened. 31 years of finding the gap in somebody else's story teaches you to go very still and very quiet the moment you find one in your own. I sat there and looked at that number the way I used to look at a forged signature on a deed. Not with panic, but with the specific cold attention of a man counting exactly how many lies it would take to build something that broken. That money wasn't just retirement savings. 22,000 of it was Eleanor's, the last payout from her pension after 30 years teaching elementary school and running the library cart 3 afternoons a week for kids who didn't have books at home. The rest was mine, built dollar by dollar out of overtime and a pension of my own, and a stubborn refusal to touch it no matter how tight things got. Eleanor and I had a plan for that money. In her last month, when she could still talk for an hour or two before the medication pulled her under, she made me promise we'd use it to finish something she'd started years earlier. A small reading room at the public library on the east side, stocked and staffed, named for her, so that kids who grew up like she did, without books in the house, would have somewhere warm to go after school. We called it the Eleanor Hensley Literacy Corner in every planning document. The closing on the lease for that space was 6 weeks out, and now the account that was supposed to fund it read $3.12. I set the tablet down, and that's when I heard the front door open without a key turning first, followed by the particular thud of somebody dragging a hand truck across my porch boards. I walked to the front hall and found 2 men in coveralls wheeling out my file cabinet, the one from my old home office, the one with 31 years of case notes I kept for sentimental reasons more than anything else. "Morning," the older one said, not stopping. "We're just following the work order." "What work order?" I said. My voice came out level. Level is a skill, not an accident. He handed me a clipboard without breaking stride. I looked down at an estate liquidation authorization, prepared by a company called Swift Clear Estate Services, and at the bottom, in handwriting I would know if you woke me up at 3 in the morning and shoved it in my face, was my daughter's signature. Paige Hensley, 32 years old. The girl I taught to ride a bike on the very driveway these men had just parked their truck in. I did not raise my voice. I did not call the police. In my career, I chased down men who moved money through 6 shell companies across 3 states to hide a single fraudulent transfer, and I learned the first rule of catching a thief a long time ago. Never let them know you've found the gap. Let them think the paperwork holds. Let them get comfortable, Comfortable people get careless, and careless people leave a trail. Careful with the drawers, I told him. They stick. He looked at me like I'd lost my mind, then shrugged and kept walking. I went back to the kitchen, sat down, and started doing the math a title examiner does instinctively, not the emotional math, the paper trail math. Somebody had drained an account holding $485,000 and forged my signature on an authorization to strip my house of its contents inside of 48 hours. That's not a spur-of-the-moment decision. That takes preparation. That takes somebody who already had documents ready to go. I picked up my phone and called Paige. It rang 4 times before she picked up, and when she did, I could hear wind and waves and somebody laughing in the background. Dad, hi. Sorry, bad connection. We're right on the beach. Paige, I said. There are men in my house taking my file cabinets. My retirement account is empty. There was a pause, then a muffled sound like she'd cupped the phone. When she came back, her voice had changed. Not guilty. Annoyed. Dad, we talked about this. We did not talk about this. You signed the paperwork last year. After the mini stroke, Dr. Osi said you needed someone managing your finances so you didn't do something reckless, and I've been managing them. I used part of it for the trip because, okay, honestly, Dad, this is the opportunity of my life. Trent's agency got us a sponsorship deal with an eco-resort chain, and if I don't show up with real production value, real content, we lose the deal. I needed capital. You weren't using that money for anything. That money was for your mother's library. Mom's been gone 2 years. A library room isn't going to bring her back. You can't keep hoarding cash for a dead woman's project while I'm trying to build an actual future, Dad. I'm sorry. But somebody had to be practical. I sat with that for a second. Somewhere behind her, I heard a man's voice, low and easy, say something I couldn't make out, and Paige laughed. A bright, careless laugh. Nothing like the girl who used to cry when she lost a library book. Who's that? I asked. Trent. Okay, we haven't told you yet, but Trent and I are engaged. We're getting married in 5 weeks. Back home at the Ridgemont Pavilion. It's going to be beautiful, and honestly, once the sponsorship money starts coming in from this trip, we'll be fine. We'll pay you back eventually. Don't be dramatic. You forged my signature, Paige. Another pause. When she spoke again, her voice had that flat, rehearsed quality people get when they've practiced a line in a mirror. The doctor's own notes say, you've had cognitive lapses since the stroke. I had every right to step in. You should be thanking me for handling this instead of letting you fumble it. I have to go, Dad. We're losing the light for the shoot. I'll call you when we land. The line went dead. I stood in my own kitchen holding a phone that had just gone silent, listening to a moving truck idle in my driveway, and I felt something in my chest go very, very cold. Not the cold of grief, which I already knew intimately. This was a different cold. It was the cold of a man who has just realized his own daughter thinks he's slow enough to rob. I want you to understand something about me before I go further. In 31 years of examining titles, I dismantled forged deeds for men who thought a fake notary stamp and a confident signature were enough to steal a farm out from under a widow. I've seen every trick a liar tells himself to feel clever. And the first thing I always learned, every single time, is that liars are lazy about the details that don't excite them. Paige was clever enough to forge my signature. She was not clever enough to wonder why her father, a man who spent 3 decades protecting other people's property from exactly this kind of theft, might have already protected his own. I walked out to the porch and watched the movers carry out Eleanor's reading chair. The wingback one she used to sit in every evening with a book in her lap and her reading glasses sliding down her nose, and I let them load it onto the truck. I did not stop them. Every instinct in me wanted to plant myself in that doorway and refuse to move, but a lifetime spent finding the gap taught me something more valuable than righteous anger. Patience wins. Rage tips your hand. Patience lets the other side build the entire case against themselves, brick by brick, while you stand quietly and watch the walls go up around them. I went inside, sat back down at the kitchen counter, and opened my laptop. Not the consumer banking app this time, the real one, the encrypted portal I still had access to from decades spent working alongside bank compliance officers on fraud cases. I traced the withdrawal. It hadn't gone out as one lump sum. It had gone in 4-wire transfers over the past 9 days, each one just under the threshold that would normally trigger an automatic fraud review, routed through a payment processor, registered to something called Sorrel Ventures LLC, out of a business address in Scottsdale, Arizona, Sorrel. Trent's last name, I ran the LLC through the Arizona Secretary of State's public registry. It had been formed 6 months earlier. Its registered agent was a third-party formation service, the kind people use specifically so their own name doesn't show up on the incorporation papers. That's not what an honest man does when he starts a legitimate marketing agency. That's what a man does when he's building a container to move money through quietly. I kept digging. Underneath the LLC's filing, buried in a linked payment gateway record most people would never think to check, was a second name attached to the account as a co-signer, not Trent Sorrel, a man named Marcus Whitlow. I didn't know that name yet. I would. By the time the moving truck pulled out of my driveway around noon, my house was down to bare walls and empty rooms, and I sat alone in the kitchen with my laptop, the forged authorization, and a name that didn't belong to anyone I'd ever met. I thought about calling the police right then. Any reasonable man would have. But a police report about a family financial dispute gets filed, gets a case number, and gets stuck in a drawer for 6 weeks, while a detective works 4 other cases at once. Page would have a lawyer within the hour explaining it away as a misunderstanding about power of attorney. And whoever Marcus Whitlow was, he'd have plenty of time to disappear before anyone came looking. I needed something a lot more precise than an angry phone call to the sheriff's department. I needed a confession, on the record. From the 2 people who thought they'd already won, I picked up my phone, opened the recording app I'd used for decades to document contentious closings, and dialed Paige's number a second time. She picked up on the 3rd ring, breathless, like she'd been running or laughing hard. "Dad, I told you, I'll call you when we land." "I just have one question," I said, keeping my voice soft, almost apologetic. "Where am I supposed to sleep tonight, Paige?" The movers took the beds. There was a pause, and then I heard her sigh, not guilt, just the particular exasperation of someone being mildly inconvenienced. "God, Dad, it's not that deep. Go to the Marriott by the Hiveway for a couple nights. It's like $90. I'll Venmo you for it once the sponsorship deposit clears. Or honestly, at your age, maybe it's time to think about assisted living anyway. Trent's mom moved into one in Sun City and she loves it. You'd have people checking on you. You clearly can't be trusted managing things alone anymore, Dad. That's the whole point of what we did." "You keep saying that. What we did, I'd fine. What I did. Trent helped me figure out the logistics, but it was my call. I'm not going to apologize for taking initiative for once in my life, instead of waiting around for you to decide when I deserve something." I let a beat of silence sit there, long enough that she'd fill it. Because guilty people and entitled people both hate silence, just for different reasons. Sure enough, she kept going. "You know what? Since we're being honest, I'm tired of being the daughter of a man who spent his whole career finding reasons other people didn't deserve what they had. You did it to strangers your whole life, and you did it to me my whole childhood. Every time I wanted something, it was we can't afford it, or that's frivolous, or your mother and I are saving for something meaningful. Well, Mom's dead, Dad. The meaningful thing you 2 were saving for died with her. I'm alive. I get to have a life. Trent's building something real for us, and I finally get to have nice things for once instead of hand-me-downs and library books. I'm not sorry. And the library room. Your mother's project. It's a room full of books for other people's kids, Dad. I'm your kid. Maybe start caring about that for once." I closed my eyes for a second. Behind her, I heard the man's voice again, closer this time. "Babe, we're losing the light. Let's go." And Paige said, "One sec, my dad's being dramatic about the movers," and I heard the particular tone people use when they're talking about someone rather than to them, dismissive and light, like discussing a minor scheduling conflict. "I have to go, Dad," she said. "I'll text you when we land. Try not to make this into a whole thing." The call ended. I looked down at the recording app. 1 minute and 58 seconds. Every word of it clean and clear. Paige's voice admitting on tape that she authorized the transfers, admitting there was no cognitive incapacity, admitting the whole thing was calculated. I saved the file in 3 separate places before I even stood up from the counter. Then I went and found the one thing the movers hadn't been able to touch, because they didn't know it existed. Under a loose floorboard in what used to be my home office, a habit left over from decades of handling sensitive closing documents I didn't trust to a filing cabinet, I kept a fireproof lockbox. Inside it was a folder Eleanor and I had built together 5 years earlier, right after my first cardiac scare, back before either of us knew cancer was coming for her instead. We didn't do it because we distrusted Paige. We did it because I'd spent 31 years watching what happens to families who don't protect what they've built. Inside that folder was the original trust document establishing the Hensley Family Legacy Trust, an irrevocable trust that had, 5 years earlier, taken legal title to this house, to both our vehicles, and to the very retirement account Paige thought she'd just drained. I sat on the bare kitchen floor with that folder in my lap and started to laugh, quietly. The first real sound I'd made all day. Whatever retirement account Paige had wired the money out of, it wasn't the trust's real holdings. 5 years ago, on my accountant's advice, we'd restructured everything. The actual $485,000 had been moved into a trust-held brokerage account requiring dual authorization and a notarized trustee release for any withdrawal over $10,000. What Paige had drained was a decoy operating account, one I kept funded at a working balance for everyday bills specifically because I'd learned professionally that predators always look for the account that's easiest to find, and the easiest account to find is never the one that matters. She hadn't stolen my retirement. She'd stolen roughly $40,000 I keep on hand, for exactly this kind of unpleasant surprise. Dressed up to look like the whole nest egg on a basic banking app screen. It was enough money to be a real crime. It was not enough money to be the catastrophe she thought she'd caused. But $485,000 had appeared to vanish, because I'd deliberately left the trust account's balance hidden from the standard app view years earlier as a security precaution, showing only the operating account by default. Paige had seen a zero balance, because that's exactly what I'd built the system to show to anyone without the trustee credentials. In the event somebody exactly like this ever tried exactly this, I want to be honest with you. I didn't feel triumphant sitting there. I felt hollowed out in a way I hadn't felt since the week Eleanor died, because the money was never really the wound. The wound was a grown woman standing on a beach, laughing, telling her father to go rot in assisted living, so she could fund a vacation with a stranger's borrowed name attached to his LLC. The wound was hearing my daughter say her mother's dying wish was worth less than a sponsorship deal. I picked myself up off that kitchen floor and I made a decision. I wasn't going to call the police that afternoon. I wasn't going to freeze the fraudulent accounts immediately, either, tempting as it was. I was going to let Paige and Trent believe, for the next 5 weeks, that they'd gotten away with it clean. I was going to use every skill 3 decades of chasing hidden money had given me to find out exactly who Marcus Whitlow was, exactly what Trent Sorrell was actually building with my daughter's future, and exactly how deep this went, because a man who spends his life reading chains of title knows a simple truth better than almost anyone. You never confront a broken link in isolation. You trace it all the way back to where it started, or the whole deal collapses again the moment you look away. 5 weeks. That was the deadline. Paige's wedding at the Ridgemont Pavilion was set for the second Saturday in May, and by then I intended to know everything. I picked up my phone one more time that evening, before I let myself sleep, and called the one person from my old professional life I still trusted completely, Renata Ibarra, a retired fraud investigator who used to work bank compliance cases alongside me for almost 20 years. Before she retired to consult privately, she answered on the second ring. "Walter Hensley," she said. "It's been a while. What's wrong?" "My daughter just tried to rob me," I said, "and I need your help proving how far it goes before I let her find out I already know." There was a pause on the line, and then Renata said the thing I needed to hear more than anything else that entire terrible day. "Tell me everything. Start from this morning." So I did. And by the time I finished, the sun had gone down completely on an empty house that used to be full of Eleanor's furniture, And somewhere in Bali, my daughter was posting sunset photographs captioned with hearts, believing the story was already over. It had barely started. That night, I slept on a borrowed air mattress in my own empty living room, because I refused to give Paige the satisfaction of checking into a motel like a man with nowhere else to go. And by 6 the next morning, I was back on the phone with Renata, working through what she'd found overnight using context she still had in the financial crimes world. Marcus Whitlow, she said, is not a marketing partner. He's a private lender, unlicensed, operating out of Scottsdale under at least 2 shell entities we've found so far. He specializes in short-term, high-interest bridge loans to people who can't get financing anywhere legitimate, usually because their credit is wrecked or because what they're financing wouldn't survive a bank's underwriting questions. He's been sued twice for predatory lending practices. Both times the plaintiffs dropped the case before trial, which tells you exactly how he keeps people quiet. So Trent borrowed from him. Trent didn't borrow from him, Walter. Sorrel Ventures owes him $110,000 taken out 4 months ago, before your daughter ever came into the picture. I pulled the filing history. Trent's so-called marketing agency has exactly 1 client contract on record, and it lapsed 8 months ago. There's no eco-resort sponsorship deal. I checked with the resort chain directly, through a contact of mine who handles their partnership marketing. They've never heard of Trent Sorrel or a company called Sorrel Ventures. I sat very still with the phone against my ear, looking at the bare wall where Eleanor's reading chair used to sit. Then what is this trip? My best guess, based on the spending pattern I'm seeing, is that Trent needed to show Whitlow he had liquidity coming in to buy himself more time on the loan before Whitlow's collection methods stopped being polite. Your daughter's $40,000 didn't go toward content production, Walter. 18,000 of it went directly into a wire transfer to one of Whitlow's shell accounts 3 days ago. The trip itself is barely funded. I think Trent needed Paige to believe they were building something real, precisely because he needed her name and her willingness to sign things attached to the story he's telling Whitlow to keep himself alive a little longer. I closed my eyes. He's using her exactly the way you'd expect a desperate man to use someone he's convinced is naive enough not to check. And Walter, there's something else. I found a second name tied to a joint checking account opened 2 weeks ago in Scottsdale, a woman named Devon Castillo. Trent's been splitting time between her apartment and wherever your daughter's been staying, whenever they're both in Arizona. Based on the transaction pattern, that relationship predates whatever's happening with Paige by at least a year. I sat with that for a long moment. There's a particular kind of stillness that settles over you when you realize the person hurting your child is being hurt himself by someone even further down the chain, and that your daughter isn't the mastermind of this story at all. She's the collateral. I thought about Paige on that beach, believing she'd finally taken control of her life for the first time, believing she'd outmaneuvered her overly cautious father, when in fact she was standing next to a man who owed a predatory lender 6 figures and was already sleeping with someone else back home. I need everything you can get me in writing, I told Renata. Bank records, the Whitlow loan documents, anything connecting Devon Castillo to Trent. And I need it before the wedding. You're going to let the wedding happen? I'm going to let them believe everything is fine right up until the moment it isn't, I said. My daughter forged my signature and told me to move into a nursing home so she could fund a lie with money meant for her dead mother's legacy. I intend to make sure that when this collapses, it collapses completely, in front of every single person who watched her walk down that aisle believing she'd built something real. Over the next 4 weeks, I did not act like a wounded father waiting by the phone. I acted like what I actually was, a man who spent 3 decades finding the gap in someone else's paper trail, methodically closing every exit before the other side even realized the walls were going up. I met with my own attorney, a sharp, quiet woman named Priya Advani, who had drafted the original Hensley Family Legacy Trust 5 years earlier, and we confirmed exactly what I already suspected. The forged authorization Paige used to justify the estate liquidation held 0 legal weight, because the actual title to the house and its contents belong to the trust, not to me personally, and a trust cannot be bound by a power of attorney executed against an individual beneficiary. Whatever SwiftClear Estate Services believed they'd been hired to do, they'd been hired based on a document with no legal authority behind it whatsoever. Priya began quietly preparing the paperwork to have every item recovered, along with a formal notice of fraud that we would hold, unsealed, until I gave the word. I also spent those weeks doing something I hadn't let myself do in the 2 years since Eleanor died. I went back to the reading room project alone. I met with the library director, a warm, tired woman named Sandra Kowalski, who had worked with Eleanor for over a decade, and I told her the truth, that the funding had hit an unexpected delay, but that it would not fall apart. She squeezed my hand across her desk and told me Eleanor used to say that the Hensleys were the most stubborn people she'd ever met, and that she meant it as the highest compliment she had. I left that meeting with a folder of blueprints for a room that didn't exist yet, and a resolve that it would exist, no matter what it cost me to make sure of it. Renata kept digging on the Whitlow angle and found something that changed the shape of everything. Whitlow wasn't simply a private lender operating in a gray area. He was under active investigation by the Arizona Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division for a pattern of loans specifically structured to trap borrowers in escalating debt through deliberately confusing balloon payment terms. The kind of predatory scheme that, once enough victims come forward, tends to end not in a quiet settlement but in criminal fraud charges. Trent Sorrell wasn't just a man who'd borrowed too much money. He was sitting on evidence, whether he realized it or not, that could matter enormously to a state investigation already circling Whitlow. That gave me an idea I hadn't considered until Renata laid the pieces out for me on a video call one evening, both of us tired. Both of us leaning toward our screens the way we used to lean over case files at adjoining desks 20 years earlier. If Trent panics before the wedding, Renata said, if he realizes Whitlow's operation is under investigation and that his own loan documents could pull him into it as a witness, or worse, he might do something reckless. People in his position usually do. He might try to disappear the debt paper trail. He might try to squeeze more money out of your daughter faster than planned. Walter, I don't think you have 5 weeks of quiet runway here. I think the timeline is shorter than you're hoping. She was right. 9 days before the wedding, Paige called me for the first time since Bali, her voice tight in a way I hadn't heard from her since she was a teenager caught in a lie. Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to not make it a whole thing. I'm listening. Trent says his business account got frozen because of some paperwork mix-up with a former investor, and he needs $11,000 to cover the venue deposit by Friday, or we lose the pavilion booking. I know things have been tight because of the trip, but this is the wedding, Dad. This is different. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't an emergency. I sat with the phone against my ear, looking out the kitchen window at Eleanor's garden, the peonies just starting to open the way they did every May, stubborn and unbothered by anything happening inside the house. My daughter, who 5 weeks earlier told me to go live out my remaining years in a facility so she wouldn't have to look at me, was now asking me for $11,000 more to fund a wedding to a man who was at that very moment financially entangled with a predatory lender under state investigation and involved with another woman 2,000 miles away. I could have told her everything right then. Some part of me wanted to, badly, wanted to end her ignorance in a single sentence and watch the illusion collapse over the phone instead of in front of 300 guests. But I thought about Eleanor and what she used to say about the difference between telling someone the truth and letting someone learn it. You can hand a person the truth, she told me once, watching a student of hers work through a hard math problem instead of just giving him the answer, or you can build the conditions where they have no choice but to find it themselves. The second one is slower. It's also the only kind that ever actually changes anybody. I'll think about it, I told Paige. Give me a day. Dad, Friday is the deadline. I said I'll think about it. I hung up, and I called Priya instead. How fast can you file the fraud notice against SwiftClear and freeze the balance of the operating account Paige drained without tipping her off? that I know anything beyond the withdrawal itself. I can have it filed quietly by end of day tomorrow, Priya said. It won't be public record for at least a week while it processes. Do it, and I want the full trust documentation ready to present the moment I need it, not before. Then I called Renata one last time before the wedding, and I told her what I needed most, a way to get eyes and ears inside the venue itself on the day of the ceremony, because whatever was going to happen at the Ridgemont Pavilion, I intended to control exactly how and when it happened, down to the minute. There's a company Eleanor and I used years back for a family reunion, I said. Full-service event security and AV. If I hire them directly for the wedding under the pretense of a father's gift, paying for the sound system and stage lighting as my contribution to the ceremony, I'd have complete access to every microphone and every speaker in that pavilion, and nobody would think twice about it. Renata was quiet for a second. You're going to give her the microphone she thinks is for her vows. I'm going to give myself the microphone she doesn't know exists, I said. And Renata, I want you there, not hidden. I want you standing exactly where Trent Sorrell can see you when the moment comes, because I have a feeling he's going to need very badly to know exactly who's been quietly building a case against him for the last month. 9 days. That's what I had left before the Ridgemont Pavilion filled with 300 guests. A string quartet, and 2 people who believed the hardest part of their scheme was already behind them. I spent every one of those 9 days finishing what 31 years of finding the gap in somebody else's story had trained me to do. And when Friday came, I did not send Paige $11,000. I sent her a text instead. 3 words. I'll be there. She never wrote back. I don't think she understood, not even slightly, what those 3 words actually meant. The 9 days before the wedding did not feel like waiting. They felt like assembly. I have built exactly one thing in my life, with my own hands, that mattered as much as this. The deck Eleanor and I put on the back of the house the summer, after Paige turned 6, board by board. Both of us learning as we went, and it had the same rhythm to it. You don't rush the framing. You make sure every joint is square before you move to the next one, because a crooked foundation doesn't show itself right away. It shows itself the day the whole structure is asked to bear weight. Renata flew in from Phoenix 4 days before the ceremony and set up what she called a working office in my kitchen, which by then had a folding table and 2 chairs in it, since the movers had taken everything else. She spread printouts across that table, the way I used to spread title abstracts across my desk downtown, and together we built the full picture, piece by piece. Marcus Whitlow's loan to Sorrell Ventures wasn't a single clean transaction. It was structured the way predatory lenders structure debt when they intend for a borrower to never actually get free of it. An initial principal of $80,000, 4 months earlier, with a repayment schedule so aggressive that Trent had already missed 2 balloon payments and accrued penalty interest that had ballooned the debt past $110,000. Renata's contact inside the Arizona Attorney General's office confirmed, off the record, that Whitlow's operation was weeks away from a formal enforcement action, and that any documentation showing a pattern of these loans would matter enormously to the case they were building. Trent, it turned out, had been telling Whitlow for the past month that a large payout was coming, sponsorship revenue from the Bali trip, he'd claimed, enough to clear the debt in full the week after the wedding. Whitlow, according to 2 texts Renata had managed to get a partial screenshot of through a source she wouldn't name, had made it extremely clear what would happen if that payment didn't arrive on schedule. The language wasn't subtle. It talked about Trent's mother's address in Sun City. It talked about people who stopped being polite when they stopped being paid. I sat at that folding table reading those texts and felt something shift in me. Not sympathy for Trent Sorrell. Exactly, because a man who lies to 2 women at once and drags my daughter into a financial trap of his own making doesn't earn sympathy from me. But I understood clearly, for the first time, what kind of desperate math had been running through his head the day he decided my daughter's father's retirement account looked like a lifeline. He wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was a drowning man who'd found someone he thought was even more naive than he was, and he'd used her exactly the way a drowning man uses anything that floats, without a second thought for whether it could carry the weight. The Devon Castillo piece was, if anything, worse in the plain human sense of it. Renata pulled 2 months of location data tied to a rideshare account Trent used under an old username, and the pattern wasn't ambiguous. 3. Sometimes 4 nights a week at an apartment complex in Tempe consistently, going back at least 14 months, well before Paige had ever met him. Devon worked as a paralegal at a firm in downtown Phoenix. She had, according to a public records search, filed a small claims complaint against Trent 8 months earlier over an unpaid loan of her own, $4,000, which she'd later withdrawn. I looked at that withdrawal date and felt something harden in my chest. People don't usually withdraw a claim like that because the debt got paid. They withdraw it because someone talked them out of pursuing it, usually with a promise. He's done this before, Renata said, watching me read. Borrow from someone close to him, promise it back, use someone else's money to buy himself time instead. Your daughter isn't the first woman in his life who thought she was building a future with him. She's the latest. I thought about calling Paige right then and laying every piece of it in front of her over the phone, sparing her the public collapse I'd been building toward. I want to be honest about that, because I don't want you thinking this was easy for me, or that I did what I did because some part of me wanted my daughter humiliated. I did not want that. But Eleanor's voice kept coming back to me, patient and certain the way she always was when she was right about something. Paige had spent 5 weeks telling herself a story where she was finally the clever one, finally the one who'd outmaneuvered her overcautious father, finally in control of her own life for the first time. A phone call from me, however gentle, would have let her fold that story into another one, that her father swooped in and rescued her again, the way he apparently always had, the way she resented. It would not have taught her the one thing I actually needed her to learn, which is that the version of her life Trent Sorrell had sold her did not exist anywhere except in her own hope that it did. So I let the days keep passing. I hired the AV company Eleanor and I had used years earlier, a small outfit run by a man named Dwayne Pruitt who remembered us fondly from a reunion a decade back, and I told him I wanted to surprise my daughter by personally covering the sound system and stage lighting for her ceremony as a father's gift. He was touched. He gave me full access to the system architecture 2 days before the event, ostensibly so I could check the levels for a planned surprise toast. What I actually did, with Renata's help, was route a secondary audio feed through my own laptop, one that could take the live microphone at the altar and, on command, override it entirely and push a separate audio file directly through every speaker in that pavilion. I also drove to the county courthouse and sat with Priya Advani for 2 hours going over exactly what she would need to file, and once the ceremony reached its natural conclusion. The fraud notice against Swift Clear Estate Services was already quietly processed. The operating account Paige had drained was frozen pending investigation, and Priya had prepared a formal report for the county prosecutor's financial crimes unit, document forgery, elder financial exploitation, and fraudulent transfer of estate assets. She would not file it that morning. She would have it ready, sitting in her car outside the pavilion, prepared to submit electronically the moment I called her. You understand, Priya said to me, closing her folder, that once this is filed, there's no controlling how far it goes. If the state decides to prosecute your daughter, that's out of both our hands. I understand, I said. I'm not doing this to control the outcome for her. I'm doing this because I refuse to let her believe there wasn't one. The morning of the wedding, I woke up on the air mattress in my empty living room and did something I hadn't done in 2 years. I opened the cedar box where I kept a handful of things from Eleanor's last weeks, and I took out her wedding ring, the plain gold band she'd worn for 41 years, which she'd asked me, near the end, to keep rather than bury with her, because she wanted some part of her present at whatever came next in this family, good or bad. I put it in my breast pocket. I don't fully know why. I think I wanted her with me, in whatever small way was possible, for what I was about to do. I dressed in the navy suit I'd worn to her funeral, because it was the only formal suit I owned that still fit properly, and because there was something fitting, in a way I didn't examine too closely, about wearing it to this instead. Renata picked me up at 2 in the afternoon, and we drove out to the Ridgemont Pavilion in near silence, the way people do before something they've spent a long time preparing for finally arrives. The venue sat at the edge of a small private lake, all glass and white timber, with rows of folding chairs already filling with guests dressed in linen and pastel, a string quartet warming up near a floral arch dense with white peonies. Paige's choice, I'd learn later, because her mother had loved them, which struck me, walking past them, as a small and terrible irony. I wasn't sure Paige herself had noticed. I found Dwayne near the sound booth, and he waved me over with the easy familiarity of a man who thought this was simply a father checking in on his gift to the day. Levels are locked in, Walter. Whenever you're ready to test that toast audio, just say the word. I'll let you know, I said, and took my seat near the back, close enough to the sound booth to reach it in 10 steps, far enough that no one watching the front of the pavilion would think to look for me there. 300 guests filled those chairs by 3:30. I recognized almost none of them. Paige's world had drifted so far from mine in the 2 years since Eleanor died that most of her friends now were people I'd never met. Colleagues from an influencer marketing circuit I only understood in the vaguest terms. I spotted Trent's mother near the front, a small, anxious-looking woman dabbing at her eyes with a tissue before the ceremony had even begun. And something in me softened toward her, briefly, because whatever her son had done, she plainly loved him the uncomplicated way mothers do, without yet understanding what he'd built his life on. At 4 o'clock, the quartet shifted into the processional, and Paige appeared at the end of the aisle in a white gown that must have cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her arm looped through the elbow of a family friend standing in for the father who was, technically, right there in the crowd, simply not asked. I felt that particular sting more than almost anything else that day, not the theft, not the forged signature, but the sight of my daughter choosing deliberately to walk toward her wedding without me beside her, as if the last conversation I'd had with her hadn't happened at all, as if she'd simply decided I no longer counted as family in the ways that mattered. Trent stood waiting at the altar in a gray suit, and I studied him properly for the first time in person. A handsome, easy-smiling man in his mid-30s with the kind of practiced warmth that comes from years of selling something to strangers. Watching him watch Paige walk toward him, I understood something Renata's research had only told me on paper. He was in that moment genuinely relieved. Not moved. Relieved. A man watching his lifeline arrive at the altar in white silk, believing, as far as I could tell, that whatever came after this ceremony would finally buy him room to breathe. The officiant, a friendly-looking woman in her 50s, opened with the standard remarks about love and commitment, and I let it wash past me, watching the room, watching Renata seated 3 rows from the front exactly where Trent would eventually see her, watching Priya's black sedan visible through the pavilion's open side wall, parked and waiting in the gravel lot beyond the lake. I thought about Eleanor's voice again as the officiant moved into the vows. She used to say that every deed tells you 2 stories, the one it claims to tell, and the one hidden underneath it, and that the entire skill of my career was learning to read both at once, without letting the first one convince you it was the only one that mattered. I sat in that folding chair, listening to Trent Sorrell promise my daughter honesty and partnership and a lifetime of shared trust, and I thought about Devin Castillo's small claims filing, about Marcus Whitlow's texts referencing his mother's address in Sun City, about the $18,000 of my dead wife's pension money that had already vanished into a debt Paige didn't even know existed. The officiant reached the part of the ceremony where she asks if anyone present has a reason the marriage should not proceed. It's a formality most modern weddings skip entirely, but Paige, in a detail that struck me as almost unbearably ironic given everything, had specifically asked for the traditional wording because her mother had loved old-fashioned ceremonies and Paige had wanted, in her words during the planning, something that felt like Mom would have approved of. The officiant asked the question, paused the way officiants do out of habit rather than expectation, and began to move on to the exchange of rings. I stood up, 300 heads turned. I felt every one of those turns land on me like weight, but I did not feel the tremor I expected. I felt, instead, the particular stillness that used to settle over me at a closing table the moment I finally laid a forged deed down in front of a room full of people who'd spent months insisting it was clean. I do, I said, into the sudden silence. Have a reason. Paige's face went through 3 expressions in the space of 2 seconds. Confusion, recognition, and then a flare of pure fury, the exact same fury I'd heard in her voice 5 weeks earlier on that beach, telling me to go find a nursing home. Dad, what are you doing? Sit down. I will, I said. In a moment. I came here to give you and Trent a wedding gift. I think you should both have it now, in front of everyone, rather than later, in private, the way you both clearly prefer to handle things you don't want witnessed. I walked toward the small aisle beside the sound booth, and Dwayne, sensing something had shifted but not yet understanding what, looked at me with a question in his eyes. I gave him a small nod. He'd agreed, days earlier, to let me handle the audio myself for the surprise, and true to his word, he stepped back from the console without a word. Trent's easy wedding day smile had drained entirely from his face. He was looking past me now, toward the back rows, and I watched the exact moment his eyes found Renata, sitting calm and unmoving 3 rows from the front, watching him the way a compliance investigator watches a man across a table when she already knows the answer to every question she's about to ask. Something in his posture changed, the loose, confident set of his shoulders tightening into something braced, cornered. Walter, he said, forcing his voice into something warm, something conciliatory, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. We can absolutely sit down after the ceremony and talk through whatever's. There's no misunderstanding, I said. I want to make sure everyone here understands that clearly, because I think a few of you are about to learn things today that matter a great deal more than the flowers. I reached the sound console and rested my hand on the small laptop I'd connected 2 days earlier. Paige was staring at me now with an expression I hadn't seen on her face since she was 19, and I caught her in the first real lie she'd ever told me. Not anger. Exactly, but the particular dread of someone who suspects, in the pit of her stomach, that whatever is about to happen is going to be worse than anything she's braced for. 5 weeks ago, I said, and I let the microphone I'd claimed carry my voice out over the still water of the lake behind the altar. Over 300 silent guests. Over the peonies Paige had chosen because her mother loved them. My daughter forged my signature on a document authorizing strangers to empty my house of everything her mother and I built together in 41 years of marriage. She drained an account meant to fund a library room named for her mother, a woman who spent 30 years making sure children who had nothing still had somewhere to read. And when I called to ask her why, she told me, and I am quoting her exactly, that I should go live out my remaining years in assisted living so I wouldn't get in the way of her building an actual future. Paige's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Somewhere in the crowd, I heard a gasp, then the low hum of 300 people beginning to whisper at once. I want to be very clear, I continued, my voice level, the way it had been level in that kitchen 5 weeks earlier, when the number on my banking app read $3.12. I am not standing here today because I want revenge for the money. I'm standing here because I refuse to let my daughter marry a man in front of everyone she knows without understanding exactly what and who she's actually marrying. I looked directly at Trent, who had gone the color of old paper. Would you like to explain to your bride, I said, who Marcus Whitlow is, or should I? I did not wait for Trent to answer. I already knew he wouldn't. Not with 300 people staring at him, and his mother's tissue frozen halfway to her face. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phones. The screen already opened to the file Renata had prepared 2 nights earlier. 4 months ago, I said, Trent Sorrell borrowed $110,000 from an unlicensed lender currently under investigation by the Arizona Attorney General's office for predatory lending practices. He has missed 2 balloon payments. I have copies of the loan documents, the payment schedule, and a series of messages from that lender describing, in fairly plain language, what happens to people who don't pay him back. I looked at Paige. whose face had gone the pale blank white of someone whose entire understanding of the last 5 weeks was being rewritten in real time in front of every person she knew. "There is no sponsorship deal," I said, as gently as I could manage while 300 strangers listened. "There was never an eco-resort partnership. Trent needed cash to convince a very dangerous man that money was coming. And he needed it badly enough that he let you believe your father was cognitively impaired so you'd feel justified draining an account that wasn't yours to touch. The trip to Bali wasn't a celebration of your future together, Paige. It was collateral in a debt you didn't know you were funding." "Huh? That's not—" Trent started, his voice cracking on the second word. "Walter, you don't understand the whole picture. I was going to pay everyone back the second the deal came through." "There is no deal," I said again, quietly this time, and something about the quiet landed harder than the volume had. "I spoke with the resort chain directly. They have never heard of you." The whispering in the crowd had turned into something closer to a low roar. Somewhere near the back I saw a woman I didn't recognize stand up and quietly usher 2 children out of the pavilion, the way a parent does when they sense a room is about to become something children shouldn't watch. I didn't blame her. Trent's mother had gone completely still, the tissue forgotten in her lap, staring at her son with an expression I recognized, because I'd worn something close to it myself 5 weeks earlier. The specific horror of realizing the person you raised has become someone you don't know at all. And then, as if the story itself had decided it wasn't finished proving my point for me, Trent's phone rang. He froze. The sound cut through the murmuring crowd, tinny and insistent, and I watched him look down at the screen with an expression of pure animal fear before he silenced it. But the pavilion's microphones, still live, had caught enough of it that half the front rows heard the ringtone clearly enough to notice when it started again 10 seconds later, and again after that. "You might want to answer that," I said. "I'd guess that's Mr. Whitlow, wondering why a very large sponsorship deposit hasn't hit the account he's expecting to see cleared by tonight." Trent didn't answer it. He stood frozen at the altar, his jaw working with no sound coming out, and I watched 20 years of practiced charm simply fail him for the first time in his adult life. I turned back to Paige. This was the part I had dreaded most, and the part I could not skip. "There's one more thing," I said, and my voice, for the first time all afternoon, wasn't entirely steady. "I wish I didn't have to tell you this today, of all days, in front of all these people. I genuinely do. But I promised myself 5 weeks ago that I would not let you build the next 50 years of your life on a story that isn't true, no matter what it cost me to say so out loud." I nodded toward Renata, who stood, walked forward with the calm, unhurried gait of a woman who had spent 2 decades delivering exactly this kind of news to exactly this kind of room, and handed me a folder. "Her name is Devon Castillo," I said. "She's a paralegal in Phoenix. She and Trent have been involved for over a year, well before he ever met you. When my investigator reached out to her 3 days ago to confirm some financial records, Devon told her something I don't think you know. Trent told her 2 weeks ago that once the sponsorship money cleared after the wedding, he planned to quietly separate from you within the year. He told her the wedding itself was, in his words, necessary optics for the business relationships he was building. She has the messages. She agreed to let us use them because she said, and I'm quoting her directly, that she was tired of being someone's contingency plan and didn't want another woman walking into the same trap she'd already been standing in." I have watched a lot of people absorb devastating information over the course of my career. I have sat across closing tables from people who just learned the property they'd spent their life savings on was built on land the seller never legally owned. I have watched grown men go white and silent when a forged signature is laid in front of them undeniably. Nothing I had ever witnessed prepared me for watching my own daughter's face fold in on itself, the way Paige's did in that moment, standing in a wedding dress that cost more than her mother had earned in a year of teaching, holding a bouquet of the flowers her dead mother loved, realizing in front of 300 people that the man she'd betrayed her own father for had never actually chosen her at all. She didn't scream. I think, in some strange way, that was worse. She simply turned to Trent, very slowly, and said, in a voice gone flat and small. Is that true? He didn't answer. That was the answer. Is it true? She said again. Louder now, the flatness cracking into something raw. Trent, look at me. Is it true? Paige, I can explain. Don't. She took a step back from him, her heel catching in the hem of her dress, and for a second I thought she might fall. And every instinct in me, every year of being her father before I was anything else, wanted to close the distance and catch her. I didn't move. This was hers to stand through, and I understood, standing there, that stepping in to soften it now would only teach her the same lesson she'd already learned too well. That someone would always be there to absorb the consequences for her no matter what she did. Trent's phone rang a third time. This time, in the silence that had swallowed the entire pavilion, everyone heard it clearly, and everyone watched him stare at it like it was a living thing. Answer it, Paige said, her voice suddenly hard in a way I hadn't heard since she was a furious teenager. Answer it, Trent. Let everyone hear exactly what kind of man I almost married. He didn't answer it. Instead, he did something that told me, more clearly than anything else that afternoon, exactly what kind of man he actually was. He turned and walked, quickly off the side of the platform, past the string quartet, past his own stunned mother, and out toward the parking lot, phone still buzzing in his hand, leaving his bride standing alone at an altar, covered in her dead mother's favorite flowers, in front of everyone either of them had ever known. The pavilion erupted into chaos after that, in the particular quiet way that respectable people manage chaos. Not shouting, mostly, but a rising tide of murmurs, chairs scraping, people standing uncertainly, unsure whether to leave, whether to approach Paige, whether any of this was actually happening. Trent's mother had begun crying openly now, and a woman I didn't know went to sit beside her, an arm around her shoulders, the two of them united in a grief that had nothing to do with me or Paige at all. I walked up to the altar. Paige was standing exactly where Trent had left her, staring at nothing, the bouquet hanging loose at her side. And when she finally looked at me, I saw something in her face I hadn't seen there in 2 years. Not since the week her mother died. When she was 19 and utterly undone and had climbed into my lap on the porch, swing the way she hadn't done since she was small, and cried until she couldn't anymore. Dad, she said, and her voice broke completely on the single syllable. I did not tell her it was going to be fine. I did not pull her into an embrace and promise her everything would be forgiven, forgotten, because it would not, and because that would have been another lie, added to a day already buried in them. I'm not here to save you from this, I said, quietly, so it was only for her, though the microphone I'd forgotten was still carried it further than I intended, out over the murmuring crowd and the still lake beyond. I'm here because I love you enough to make sure you finally see it. All of it. Not the version you can talk yourself into believing. You could have told me privately, she said, and there was real anger in it now, cutting through the shock. You could have called me before I got up this morning and put on this dress. Why would you do it like this, in front of everyone? Because you told me, 5 weeks ago, that I should thank you for handling my finances the way you did, I said. Because you told your dying mother's legacy meant less to you than a stranger's sponsorship deal. Because you told me to go find a nursing home so I'd stop being an inconvenience to the life you were building. I let you believe, for 5 weeks, that you'd won. I let you stand up here today believing the story you told yourself, and I did that because I needed you to understand completely and undeniably, in front of the exact people you wanted to impress with this life, that the story wasn't true. A quiet phone call wouldn't have taught you that, Paige. You'd have found a way to explain it away. You always do. She flinched at that, and I watched something in her face shift, the anger draining into something closer to recognition. Am I going to be arrested? She asked in a small voice, and the question told me she already knew the answer, had probably known it, on some buried level, since the moment I stood up in that first row of chairs. I don't know yet, I said honestly. My attorney has a report prepared documenting the forgery and the fraudulent transfer. Whether it gets filed depends on some conversations we still need to have, once today is over and neither of us is standing in front of 300 people. I want to be honest with you about something else, too, because I think you need to hear it today and not later, when it's easier to soften. I love you. I have loved you every single day of your entire life, including the day you drained an account meant to honor your mother's memory. But loving you does not mean protecting you from what you've done. It never did. I think somewhere along the way, I let you believe it did, and that's on me as much as it's on you. I'm not making that mistake again. She was crying now, the careful wedding makeup running in dark lines down her cheeks, and around us the pavilion had begun to empty in earnest. Guests filing out in twos and threes with the particular hush of people who have witnessed something they will talk about for years but have no idea how to respond to in the moment. Renata stood a respectful distance away, giving us the space, though I caught her eye once and saw the same steady calm she'd carried through the whole ordeal. I reached into my breast pocket and took out Eleanor's wedding ring, the plain gold band I'd carried with me all day without fully understanding why until that exact moment. I held it out to Paige. Your mother wanted you to have this someday, I said. Not today, not like this. But I think she'd want you to have it now more than ever. Not as a wedding ring. Not as anything to do with Trent Sorrell. As a reminder of what it actually looks like when two people build something honest together. Slowly, without stealing from anyone to do it. She and I didn't have much when we started. We built everything with what we had, honestly, one board at a time. That's the only kind of foundation that ever actually holds, Paige. I learned that examining broken chains of title for 31 years, and I learned it again watching what happened to you the moment you tried to skip past it. She took the ring with shaking hands and held it against her chest, and for a long moment neither of us said anything at all, standing together at the edge of an altar surrounded by wilting peonies and empty folding chairs, while somewhere out in the parking lot, Trent Sorrell's phone rang for what I would later learn was the 11th time that hour. Marcus Whitlow, it turned out, did not wait patiently for his money. 3 days after the collapsed wedding, according to a report Renata forwarded me from a contact at the county sheriff's department, Trent Sorrell was found badly beaten in the parking lot of a discount motel outside Tempe, the kind of injury pattern investigators associate specifically with debt collection rather than robbery, since his wallet and phone had both been left untouched beside him. He survived. He also, faced with hospital bills and a debt he could no longer hide from anyone, finally cooperated with the ongoing state investigation into Whitlow's lending operation, providing documentation that Renata's contact told her was, in the end, instrumental in building the criminal case that led to Whitlow's arrest 6 weeks later, on multiple counts of predatory lending and extortion. It is a strange thing, watching a man's own cowardice eventually do more good than his courage ever could have. I did not feel sorry for Trent Sorrell. I did feel, in a complicated way I hadn't expected, a kind of grim satisfaction that the very debt he'd used to justify robbing my family ended up being the thing that finally caught up with him. Devon Castillo, for what it's worth, sent Paige a message a week after the wedding, not an apology, exactly, but something close to one, telling her she was sorry Paige had to find out the way she did, and that she hoped, for both their sakes, they'd each learned the same lesson about trusting a man's promises over the paperwork underneath them. I don't know if Paige ever wrote back. I never asked. As for Paige herself, the weeks that followed were the hardest of my life since Eleanor's illness, and I include in that comparison the day I watched movers carry my wife's reading chair out of my own front door. Priya filed the fraud report 10 days after the wedding, once Paige and I had finally sat down together in the empty house, on 2 folding chairs at the kitchen counter where this whole thing had started, and talked through everything neither of us had said honestly to each other, in longer than either of us wanted to admit. I told her the truth about the trust, about the decoy account, about 5 years of quiet precautions Eleanor and I had built specifically because I'd spent a career watching what happens to families who don't protect what they build. Paige told me things I hadn't fully understood either. How alone she'd felt in the 2 years since her mother died. How she'd watched me pour every remaining ounce of care I had left into a library room for strangers' children, while she sat in an empty apartment across town, wondering when it would be her turn to matter that much to me again. I won't pretend that excuses what she did. It doesn't. But I understood, sitting across from her at that counter, that grief had made a gap in both of us, and that a con man like Trent Sorrell had simply been patient enough to find it before I did. The county prosecutor's office, weighing the forged authorization against a first offense, Page's full cooperation once charges were filed, and a restitution agreement Priya and I structured personally rather than through the court, offered a plea to a reduced charge, 3 years of probation, a permanent restraining order on any future power of attorney or financial authority over my affairs, 400 hours of community service, and full restitution of the $40,000 to be paid back over 5 years directly into the trust account she'd drained. I did not fight for a harsher sentence, and I did not fight for leniency either. I told the prosecutor the truth, on the record, the same truth I'd told Paige at that kitchen counter, that I wanted her to face what she'd done fully, without me standing between her and the consequences the way I apparently always had, but that I did not believe destroying the rest of her life served either justice or her mother's memory. It has been 11 months since that wedding. The Eleanor Hensley Literacy Corner opened on the east side of Columbus in September, funded in full exactly the way Eleanor and I planned it 5 years ago, stocked with shelves of books and staffed 3 afternoons a week by volunteers who remember her fondly from decades running that same library cart. I cut the ribbon myself on a bright, cold morning, and I stood there afterward, watching the first group of kids come through the door and head straight for the shelves, the way kids do when a room finally belongs to them. And I thought about the version of myself who sat frozen at a kitchen counter 11 months earlier, staring at a bank balance that read $3.12, believing for one long, cold minute that everything Eleanor and I built together had simply evaporated. Paige works 4 hours every Saturday at that reading room now, part of her community service, though she's asked to stay on as a regular volunteer once the hours are complete, and I did not argue with her about that either. I watch her sometimes, from across the room, sitting cross-legged on the floor, reading to a group of 7-year-olds the way her mother used to read to her, and I see, in flashes, something of the daughter I remember from before grief made a gap in both of us wide enough for a stranger to walk through. We are not fully repaired, Paige and I. I don't know that we ever fully will be, and I've made a kind of peace with that, the same slow peace it took me 2 years to make with an empty half of a bed. But we talk now, most weeks, honestly, in a way we hadn't managed in longer than either of us wants to admit. She calls me sometimes just to tell me about a kid at the library who finally finished their first chapter book, and I hear, in those calls, something I haven't heard from her since she was very young. Not performance, not persuasion, just a daughter telling her father something true because she wants him to know it, not because she needs something from him in exchange. I think about the chain of title often these days, more than I used to even when it was my whole career. Every deed carries 2 stories, the one it claims and the one underneath it, and the only way to ever really know which is true is to trace it all the way back, patiently, however long that takes, and refuse to accept the version that skips the hard parts. Families are not so different. Mine had a gap in it, and I spent 31 years learning exactly how to find one before it collapsed something I couldn't rebuild. We found it in time. I don't know that every family does, but I know this much for certain, sitting most mornings now at a kitchen counter with 2 cups of coffee, one of them still mine to finish alone. A title, like a family, is only as strong as the truth underneath it, and the only foundation that ever really holds is the one you're willing to dig all the way down to find.